Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk, and today I'm teaching you guys how to make a very customizable and configurable enemy spawning system. You can use this for a ton of things inside of your game. It's a really simple and effective way to go about spawning enemies. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the way this enemy spawning system is going to work is we're going to choose an enemy from a random array of enemies. Then we're going to instantiate that enemy between two random amounts of time. So it's going to be how frequently our enemy spawns. Then we're going to have a variable to check if we can spawn. And we're also going to have another variable to see how long we want to spawn enemies for. And then we're also going to use a variable to increment how many enemies are in our room, so we can track that and tell if our spawner has been completed and every enemy has been killed. So let's get right into it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new C# script. You can call something like enemy spawning, and I already have an enemy spawning script right here, and we can just double click to open this script up. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a bunch of variables that can control our enemy spawner. And the first thing we're going to do is make a public game object array and call it spawn points. So this is going to be an array, but it's going to store all the possible places that we can spawn our enemy. Next thing I'm going to do is make a game object called current point, and right here this is going to be the actual point that we choose to spawn our enemy at once we randomly choose a spawn point. And the next thing we're going to do is going to make an integer called index, and this is just going to be something that we use to handle the actual position in the array that we choose to spawn the enemy from. Now the next thing we are going to do is make some public game object. I'm going to make a public game object array called enemies, and this is going to store all of our enemies that we can randomly choose from one and choose to spawn it. And then we are going to make a public float. We're going to call this min time between spawns, and make also a public float and call it max time between spawns. And we're going to use these variables to choose how frequently we want to spawn our enemies. So this could be, we could spawn them very frequently or not too frequently, depending on the values that we choose for these. And we're going to use making some randomness and choose a random amount between those two times. Now, the next thing we're going to do is make a public bool called can spawn, and we also are going to make, which is going to tell if our spawner can actually spawn. So once we run out of time, we are going to set that to false, for example. We also are going to make a public float called spawn time, and this is going to handle how long we're actually spawning enemies for. So we could spawn enemies for something like 10 seconds straight or 20 seconds. It really depends, but it's just how long our spawner is actually active and spawning enemies. Next thing we're going to do is make a public int called enemies in room, and this is going to help us determine how many enemies are in our room. And every single time we spawn an enemy, we're going to increment this by 1. Every time an enemy gets destroyed, we're going to decrease this by 1. So this is just going to help us track when our spawner is actually done, because we want our spawner to not only when the spawn time is at less than 0 or equal to 0, we also want to make sure that we've killed all the enemies in our room, and not that we can just, our spawner's done when the time runs out. Finally, we are going to make just 2 more variables, and we're going to make a public bool called spawner done, which we're going to you can use this anywhere in your script just to manage whenever your spawner is done and do something there. And we're going to also, just to show this, I'm going to make a public game object called like spawner done game object, which I'm just going to set this to active whenever our spawner is done, just to show that our spawner has indeed been completed. Now we actually just have to make one function that's going to pretty much handle all of the spawning inside of the spawning script. So I'm going to make a void. I'm just going to call it something like spawn enemy, and the first thing I want to do actually in this script is make sure inside of our start function, so I want to invoke our spawn enemy script. So I'm going to take in our function, and let's just say after 0.5 seconds. So we just want to make sure to call that function right when we right when this game object is active or whatever. So next thing we are going to do is we're going to take our index, which is just going to be a just number pretty much of where a random spot inside of this inside of the spawn points. So we're gonna set this to is random.range, and we're gonna make it 0 and spawn points.length. So we're gonna choose pretty much a random spawn point and store it inside of this index, which is an integer. Now we're going to say our current point, which is the actual point that we want to spawn our enemy. We want to set this equal to spawn points and then index. So this is going to be our spawn points is all of our spawn points possible. This is going to be one of those randomly chosen that we actually chose to spawn. Next, we're going to make a float called time between spawns. This is going to be how frequently we actually spawn our enemies. So I'm going to set this to random.range, and then we're going to take in min time between spawns and comma max time between spawns. So I have to choose a random value between the two minimum time and maximum times we choose to spawn our enemy. Next thing I'm going to do is make an if statement saying if we can spawn, well then we want to spawn an enemy. So I'm going to do this by instantiating, and where I want to instantiate, first thing we take in is the actual object we want to instantiate. So I want to instantiate a random enemy that we've chosen from our enemies array. Again, we can just do this with one enemy, it'll work just fine, but if we have multiple enemies, you might just want to have it be that it chooses one of those randomly from your game object or from your array. So it works fine with just one, but it'll randomly choose one if you have more than one. So what we're going to do is get our enemy array, and the actual enemy we want to spawn is random.range, not rotation, .range, and we're going to pass in 0 and our enemies length, so how many enemies we have inside of our array. And so this is kind of similar to what we're doing right here, just in a different kind of context. Now the next thing it takes in is a position. Of course we want to spawn that is the current point dot transform dot position, and this is like the what we've chosen right here, where we the actual game object that we want to spawn our enemy at. Next thing we're going to do is just pass in rotation, which doesn't really matter too much for here, so I'm going to just make a quaternion.identity. And the next thing we want to do is once we've instantiated an enemy, well, we want to tell our enemies in room variable that we've added an enemy to the room, so we're just going to increment that by 1. As of now, this function is only being called one time, so we want to make sure to invoke our spawn enemy, which is our function right here, and we're going to invoke it and our time between spawns. So we're going to invoke this function every single time, how long pretty much that, how frequently we want our enemies to spawn. So that'll keep doing that. And then what we want to also check is if our spawner done, and we haven't declared when our spawner is done, but we'll do that inside of our enemy script, so don't worry about that. We're going to check if our spawner is done. Well, then what we want to do is you're going to say that this is done spawning. You can do a wide variety of things inside of here. For example, I'm just going to say our spawner done game object dot set active to true, just so we have a visual representation that our spawner is indeed done spawning. Now I'm going to save this script, and I actually already made another script called enemy script, but you can do this if you already have a pre-existing enemy script. You can just pop in these few lines of code right inside of there. So this should be pretty easy just to add into your existing enemy script, and if you don't have one, I can just make a super simple one for now, just for the purpose of this tutorial. So the first thing I want to do is get a reference to our enemy spawning script. Make sure you save that script before you do this. Is we want to make sure we get a private enemy spawning. Ignore the enemy spawner script, that's just another script I used. And we're going to say this, we're going to call this enemy spawning. Something like that. Now, if you don't have a void take damage, now, like you might have some kind of void inside of your, or function inside of your enemy script. If you already have one that just takes damage to your enemy, if you have this, just pop in these few lines of code. I'm just going to destroy my game object here. But if you already have an enemy that does this, or a function, just pop in these next few lines of code and it should work just fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to initialize our enemy spawning equal to find object of type enemy spawning. Now you'll notice that this might not work if you have multiple enemy spawners. So what I like to do is also just make some, I have another script that I won't get into too much for the sake because it's a little complicated, but I just make sure to set my script active when I make sure to set my script disabled when I'm not in the room, and make sure to set it enabled when I'm actually like in this certain kind of room, but we won't get into that for now. But this could possibly cause some issues in the future if you have like multiple spawners. But like, if you have any comments, just let me know in the comments below. Now inside of this, we are going to say enemy spawning dot enemies in room. And we want to decrement or decrease this by 1. And yeah, now we're just telling that once our enemy dies or takes damage, we want to say that we just lost that enemy that was in the room before. So now inside here we're gonna check if our enemy we're gonna check if our spawner should be done, pretty much. So inside of here, we're not gonna do this inside of update, which is pretty nice. We're gonna check if our enemy spawning dot spawn time, which is how long. I actually will get into actually decrementing the spawn time just a second here. We're going to check if our spawn time is less than or equal to 0, and so we're pretty much done spawning, and our enemy spawning dot enemies in room is less than or equal to 0. And pretty much we just want to, if we didn't have this line of code right here, our spawner would just be said to be done. I set our enemy spawning dot spawner done equal to true. But pretty much I was saying, if we didn't have this line of code, it would just be done when our spawn time goes to 0. And so after like 15 seconds every time. We want to actually make sure all of our enemies have been killed inside the room, and there's just not one left. So that's the point of this function right here. Now we actually want to decrease our spawn time and make sure that we actually decrease it, which I kind of forgot to do inside of the enemy spawning script. So let's save this and go back into the enemy spawning script, and we need to make the update function. Inside of here, we're going to check if we can spawn. Well then, if we do, we want to spawn, we want to get our spawn time, which is how long we're spawning for, and minus equal by time dot delta time, which will pretty much act like a countdown timer and just decrease this by 1 every single second. Inside of here, we also want to check if our spawn time is less than 0, and if it is, we want to set our can spawn equal to false. Now that's not all. Actually, inside of you can see inside of the script we take damage here, but if you already have something like that, you want to make sure that wherever your enemy takes damage, you want to make sure to call this function, or you could just pop these lines into some pre-existing function. But for example here, I do have in my projectile script where I actually kind of destroy my enemy. You want to make sure to add this line of code wherever you kind of destroy the enemy, and make sure to say find object type enemy script dot take damage. But the point is, you need to call this function wherever it's necessary inside of your project. Now the next thing we are going to do is, once we head into here, we can make sure I already have an enemy spawning script, but I'll just get rid of this for the sake of this tutorial. So I'm going to go into my room script, or not room script, but room. I kind of made this room game object already, just kind of this room that we're in right here. And I'm going to make a empty object and call it enemy spawning. Now I'm going to make sure to drag this inside the room, and we're going to add the enemy spawning script right in here. Now we need to configure a few variables. I'm going to make sure to lock this inspector right here and click the lock, just so we can easily drag these objects into here. So the first thing we need to initialize or determine is our spawn points. So I already have a bunch of different spawn points. I have the game object, and it just stores all my different spawn points in here. As you can see, I've also just given them this little icon just so I can see them easily. But yeah, I already have made just some empty game objects. Ignore this. Just some empty game objects that just have different positions on them, and so you can make a bunch of different things, and you can have just one spawn point, or you can have a bunch of different. That's what I like about the script, is it's very configurable and customizable. So what I'm gonna do is lock this inspector again here, and I'm gonna hold shift, drag all these spawn points just into our thing, and they should automatically all add. Next thing we want to do is add our enemies. So you could have like 10 different enemies and choose randomly from those things, but I only have one enemy, and it's just a prefab. It's just this test enemy, and he's literally just a rigid body box glider animation. It just has the enemy script on him, but you probably already have a pre-existing enemy if you're watching this tutorial. Now we need to set our minimum time between spawns. So let's say I want to spawn randomly between 1 and 3 seconds. So choose a random time between then, and that's how frequently I really want to spawn. We want to make sure to check this box so we can spawn. I probably should have initialized that in the script, but I kind of forgot. And then let's say we want to set our spawn time. So how long we're actually spawning our enemies for. We set this like 15 seconds. Now, you don't actually want to configure this enemies in a room, but I just like to keep it here just so we can see it in the side of the script, or inside the inspector. Now, also, I have this spawner done game object. Where is it? Spawner completed. And it's just, I make sure to set it not as active. I made sure to set it not active initially, but it's just a check mark that can tell when our spawner has been completed. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. And I'm going to drag this into our enemy spawning, just spawner completed. Again, you can do many things with this variable. Like whenever a spawner is done, you can give your enemy player some money, just do a bunch of different things. So this is just a brief example. So let's actually hop and make sure and see if our script works. So let's hit play. As you can see, my enemies are spawning in. And sorry, my projectile script is a little messed up for now. I'm not really sure. This is just an old project that I was demoing on. But as you can see, whenever we spawn an enemy, the enemies in room goes up. And you can see now that our spawn time, it is stopped. It is below 0. We're not spawning any more enemies in here. So let's just destroy that enemy. It goes down to 1. And we're not ending the spawner just yet. Once we destroy this last boy, you'll see our spawner is done, and we set this game object to true. So yeah, that's pretty much our spawner tutorial, or spawner enemy spawning tutorial. I think it's a pretty simple and effective way to just go about enemy spawning. Pretty simple, and I think it's just like very customizable way. So yeah, if you guys like this video, make sure to let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, please let me know in the comments. I'll try to read. I usually read all comments and just try to reply to some of them. But yeah, if you like the video, just maybe give me a like or subscribe, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.